Welcome to a new video in the series on UI Builder for Node-RED. And in this video, we're going to look at some of the new features that were introduced with version 6.1. So before we get started, please make sure that you are running, if you're following along, the very latest version, and you'll notice that this is 6.1.1 because I've just released a point upgrade because I realized that one of the examples was incorrect. And we're going to use that example right now because it demonstrates a lot of the zero code capabilities for UI Builder. So we come to the menu, the import menu, we look at examples, look under the UI Builder, and you can see these are all the new examples that have been all updated for version 6.1, and the one that we're interested in today is this one called Zero Code. So let's go ahead and import that, and you'll see that it's imported a whole bunch of stuff, and that gives us a brand new tab. And on this tab, we have a whole bunch of things to look at, which looks a bit daunting to begin with, but should be fine. Now, as always, when you look at a new UI Builder node, just make sure that it's not clashing with something else. If it is, it will give you a blank URL there. If that's the case, just double click and open it. And change the name. And you'll see, as always, it's warning you this URL does not yet exist, so you have to deploy first. So let's do that right now. So we need to deploy. This URL is okay, so I'm going to press deploy, and that's now created all of the files and features that we need to use this UI Builder node. And we can now go into here and we can open, and you'll see that there's been some changes. If you're used to version 6 or before of UI Builder, you'll see that I've made a few changes, hopefully that will be appreciated. I'm going to tear this off and we're going to put it to one side there, and we'll move this one across here so that we can see what we're doing. Let's turn these off for a second. Here we go. And you can see we've got UIB-element test open, and currently it's blank. This is the new so-called blank template. So if we open that, you can see that the template is the blank template, and that's quite important because, as you can see, there's not a lot of stuff in that blank template. In fact, let's go and have a quick look. Here's the sum total of the HTML, which is pretty much nothing. And a quick look at the JavaScript. That literally is nothing. And you will note that the JavaScript is now commented out in the main HTML code because you don't need that anymore for a lot of stuff. So that's one of the big changes here for version 6.1. So let's go now and have a quick look at some of these features and start walking them through. First of all, just a quick look at the structure of these flows. So this is simply a link which makes our flows look a lot neater. So this is feeding all of the data from elsewhere into this node. And we have the usual two outputs, not doing anything with them in this example. And in fact, we've got the control outputs just turned off because we're not particularly interested in those here. So let's start by having a look at one or two of the new features. So first of all, we have got a reload button here, which if I click that, you didn't even see anything change, but believe you me, it did. So let's use one of the others. This is a new feature called the status, what I found was that some people who may be working with mobile phones struggle to see how UI Builder, the client of UI Builder, is configured. So this is a new status display that helps you look at that. And this is a live display. It will update. In fact, if I send a message here, you'll see that that number updated. Let's just do that again. Watch the number change. There we go. So that is useful. And if I click that again, it turns off. So let's just have a quick look at that. Yep, that's it. So I'm sending a command to the client. It's using message._UIB command show status. And show status is one of the functions that's available in the UI Builder client. So you can use that yourself in your front-end code as well. It's all in the documentation. For those of you who are used to UI Builder, you're probably used to seeing all of the templates have a message display in them. That is no longer the case. It's all been removed, and that's because that is now more dynamic. So if I click on this, I now get that message display, and if I send a new message, you'll see it update. And again, we can click on that. And you'll notice that these are completely generic. So you can take this, copy it, and put it onto a different UI Builder node, and it will still work exactly the same way. And this is set up to add the message to the end of what's already on your screen. So if you need to move it out of the way, you can just undo it and put it back again. And there we go. And it always shows whatever the last message was that went into UI Builder. And because we're controlling from the front end, in this particular case, that's always going to be the toggle. These ones control the log level. One of the things that you need to become familiar with UI Builder is your browser's developer tools. And you can open these, usually pressing the F12 button will open these. So let's look at the console. At the moment, console's not showing a lot, and that's very deliberate. UI Builder client will only show errors. It won't show anything else, but we can change that. The log levels run from 0, which is the default, to showing errors, right up to level 5, which shows you trace messages. And here we can see I've just clicked that button and I've told UI Builder to, here's another command, to turn the log level up to 5. And I've done that using UI Builder's set function. And so I said set log level to 5, and that gives us our trace display. That can be useful if you're trying to track down something odd happening. But let's turn that off again. More importantly, perhaps, this is a display that you need to get familiar with. This gives you what the browser thinks that you've told it to do. And equally importantly, it tells you for anything that's on display here. So if I have a look at this one, you can see that this has no element styling, which is correct, but then you can see all of the styling that it inherits. So, and in fact, you can see all of the styles that are defined in the brand, the UIB brand CSS. Loads and loads of things now that you can make use of in your own code as well. And you'll see at the bottom here that it tells you the CSS selectors. One of the things that you'll become familiar with when using the newer features of UI Builder is how to work out what selector, what CSS selector you need. And as an easy way here, we can copy the selector, and that will copy the selector for that particular div tag, and we can use that elsewhere. And we'll have a look at that in a minute. Okay, let's go back to this. So I'm going to turn the messages off. I don't need those at the moment. So let's have a look now at the new features. So this node is called a UIB-element node. And this is what the configuration looks like. Just quickly looking at that second tab, there's nothing on the second tab as yet. That's being held for future features. So in the UIB-element node, the first thing that we note is the type. And we drop that down, and you can see there's a whole bunch of things here that you can now create using zero code. So each of these will create something on screen. So let's just quickly have a look at this. This is set to an unordered list. Excuse me. We're going to send it some very simple data. Literally, that's an array with a few entries in, a nested array in there as well, just to see what that does. And that's literally it. So what does that do if we fire that off? Well, here you can see it's created all of this. It's created a level 2 heading for us, and it's created a list, a bullet list. 1, 2, there's our nested list. You can see it's turned that into a list on the same bullet. So very, very simple for very simple data. Let's go back and have a look at the configuration again. So how have we made that work? So we've told it that we want an unordered list. And you'll see here that as you change these, the information down here changes. So that's just a useful thing. And they all have, hopefully they all have anyway, links to the more detailed documentation. And if you click on that, that will actually take us into the documentation. In this particular case, unfortunately, that is not yet ready. The documentation is still catching up a little bit, but hopefully these should be fairly simple to use, and they give you a hint as to what input information you need in order to be able to generate your output. And we've already seen that the payload was a simple array of strings, as it says there. So now that we've seen the types, let's look at the other parts. So the first thing to look at is this, the parent. And to understand what that means, we need to look at the structure of our HTML document. And we're going to do that quite simply by coming back to here and opening up our DevTools again. And so we're looking on the Elements tab. This is Microsoft Edge. Other browsers will have something similar. And we can see that we've got a very distinct hierarchy to our document. It starts at the top with the HTML tag. Then we have the head and body tags. And then within the body, we have some other tags, including this tag here, the div tag, which has an ID of more on it. And inside there, we have something else. And this is what's being created dynamically by UIBuilder for you from your data. And you'll notice that it's got some labeling in there to try and make the outputs that we're producing accessible to people with screen readers and so on. So the important thing here is this. So all of the template files and the examples now have this standard div in there called more. And so we can often use that as the parent so that our examples appear inside that tag, which just makes life a bit easier when you're looking at the structure. And so for an ID attribute, we put a hash on the front. And this is a CSS selector that we've mentioned before. And the documentation has links out to what that actually means and a better description of it. So make use of that. There always has to be a parent. So if you don't want it in a div here, the parent you should use would be just called body. So use body in here if you need to just attach it to the body. And you'll see a bit further down, we've also got position, and the position defaults to last, which means that if we were to leave it like this, when we sent our data in and it attached it to the web page, it would put it as the last element in the body. Or if we change that back to our more, then it would put it as the last entry under more. And to note that if you resend data to the same UIB element node, it will replace what was already there. So that's nice and handy. Interestingly, you'll find that even with some quite complex data, that update is instantaneous. As well as last, we could make that either first, or we could give it a number. And they do what is hopefully fairly obvious, put it as the first entry under the parent, or slot it in between numerous entries. And we'll look again at that in a while. The next thing to note here is the ID, and this is absolutely critical. So you must have an ID on here that is unique to your page. And what that does is, if we open this up, you'll notice that the ID is here. So the thing that UI Builder has created for you is given an ID, and that's critical because without that, it's much harder to for UI Builder to go and make changes to things later on. So make sure that that is unique across your page. We've covered the position already. Heading is optional, so you can leave that blank if you don't want a heading. This is the heading that it's created. You'll notice that we asked it to do a heading level 2, which is exactly what is done. You can create headings from level 2 up to level 6. You can't create a level 1 heading. There should only be ever one level 1 heading on the page, and typically the templates already include a level 1 heading with a subtitle. So it's a title and a subtitle. Topic and the name, not particularly important. The name is just shown on screen. The topic is useful for when we're looking at chaining all of these together, and particularly when we're going to use caching to enable UI Builder to give you the very latest data if you connect a new client. I'm not going to cover that in this video, cover that in another one. So that's it. That's the configuration. And as we've seen, let's get rid of this, that creates a list. Now, I've given a couple of different examples of data here. So this is another way of doing this. If we open this up, it's a bit more complicated, but sometimes you don't want an array. Sometimes you want a JavaScript object, and that's how this works. Both styles work. Here, as you can see, fairly straightforward structure. Hopefully it's fairly obvious. And if I send that to the node, watch the screen on the right, you'll see very subtle changed. You can see just how quick that change is. There's no flashing on screen or anything like that. So it's just replacing that whole list each time. And the final button is remove. And as you can see, this is very, very simple. Send a message.mode of remove, and it will do precisely that. So there we go. So let's go back. Let's put that list back in again. And let's now have a look at some of these. So this one, as it says, dynamically add a row to an existing list. So we've got our list on screen. This again is a UIB element node. So let's see how that's configured. This one, add row to existing ordered or unordered list. As you know, this is an unordered list, a bullet point list. So one of these. So this lets us add to that. Now the parent this time has changed. So the parent ID needs to be the ID of the list that we created up here, which you may remember what that was, but that's what it is. In this particular case, we don't need an ID because we won't be dealing with the list entries at this level. You can put one in there, though it certainly doesn't hurt. And the position still works. So here it's still set to last. The heading is ignored. So let's just see how that works. So let's inject something. What have we got here to inject? A new list entry. Let's do that. And there it is. Because it's set to last, it was added to the end of the list. We can even send an array of entries. As you can see, there's 2 entries in that array, and we get 2 entries added to the list, which is all well and good. What happens if you want to insert something into the middle of the list, though? Well, that's easy enough as well. Let's say we want to insert something after entry number 3. Let's change that. Click deploy. Now let's insert. And as you can see, it's inserted the same data, but it's now after entry number 3. Now we can look at one of the other new nodes, which is the UIB update node. Here we can see that we have 2 modes in this node, update and delete. And we can also set that dynamically from message.mode if we want to send that in. But this is set to update. Now, what are we going to update? And this is a little bit more complicated. So this particular one is using Node-RED's JSONata expression editor to give us a dynamic view. So in this particular case, what we're saying here is that from the list, if you remember that's the ID of the list that we created, we're going to look at the list item, that's each of these, nth child. So what that means is the nth list item is the one that we want to select. But we haven't hard-coded that, which obviously we could do, it's just a number. What we're doing here is taking that from the payload that we're going to send it. So let's just have a quick look at what that payload is. Here is the payload, simply the number 2. We can ignore these other bits. Let's go back into here. So that tells us what we are going to update. So again, it's a CSS selector. Now, we have a couple of things that we can update at the moment, and this will undoubtedly get extended in future releases. You can either change what is called here the content source, or is sometimes called the slot content, which is basically the text or HTML that appears in the selected element. So if we were to update element number 2, which is what we have asked it to do, so this is element number 2 of the list, we can see that it currently says li space 2. So we could put something in here. In fact, let's do that now. Oops, we don't want to take it from the message though. In this case, we want it just to be a simple string. So this is going to update that entry and give it that text. But in this case, we've said tick it off. So what we want to do here is actually change the bullet. And this is a piece of HTML. In this case, we're actually looking at some CSS, some cascading style sheet definitions. We're going to give it a specific style. And you can look all these up online, but if we just expand that, what we're saying is that the style is going to be list style, and then we've given it a tick emoji. The backslashes before these just mean that we don't have to worry about nested quotes. I could have equally made that to a single quote, in which case it wouldn't worry about it. It's a bit simpler. So yeah, let's see what that does. We've made a change, so we deploy and we click the button, and lo and behold, we've made 2 changes to that list item. We've ticked it off and we've said hello. So that's how that works. Now this may seem a little complex, but it is standard CSS. So a little investment in learning a bit about CSS will go a long way in UI Builder. And of course, you don't have to do this. This is just an example. In many cases, rather than using a style override, you'll want to use a CSS class, which you can define in your index.css file, or pick up one of the existing ones out of the UIB brand CSS file. There are other attributes, obviously. This will take any attributes, and we don't have to define that manually. We can pick it up from the message, or we can pick it up from a flow or global variable, or we could, again, make it a dynamic expression if we wanted to. This one, just to quickly mention, when we're sending this content source, by the way, this is actually HTML. So let's try that quickly. And you can see that text is bold. But if you wanted to use markdown formatting, if you don't know what that is, don't worry about it for now. If you do know what that is, you may find this useful. And UI Builder, the client, supports Markdown using the Markdown it library. So if you load that library into your front-end web page before you load the the UI Builder library, then you can in fact send Markdown here instead of HTML, and you may find that useful. Also, you might find useful is the fact that if you load a library called DOM Purify, which is another well-known library, again loading that into your front end before you load UI Builder, that will actually go through and it will sanitize any inputs for you, which can be useful if you're writing a bigger application that is going to be used by lots of people, particularly if you're going to be used over the internet. Again, the documentation has all the details. Okay, what else can we do? Update all of the list entries. Let's see what that does. Bang. So in this case, it's put a little ambulance symbol against all of the entries. And again, this is a bit of a simpler, same kind of thing here. But the selector is a bit easier here. So this is worth noting. Whereas previously, if we just remind ourselves what that looked like, this was a fairly complex looking selector. Basically, if we take the dynamic bits out, it would just have the number 2 in there. So that's looking at the second child of the parent. In this instance, we're just telling it to look for li, list item. And that will return a set of values. In other words, all of the list items in that list. And so we can update all of them at the same time. And that may be quite useful to you. So for example, you'd been ticking some things off and you wanted to undo all of that, then a single command will do that. Similarly, if you wanted to tick all of them off, a single command will do that for you. And one final thing, delete number 2. So here we're looking at the delete mode of the update node. Again, as you can see, we're picking off a dynamic child. So, and we don't need to fill any of the rest in because we're not using those. And here, payload is number 2 again. So watch out for this one to disappear. Bang. And if I do that again, you'll notice it keeps deleting number 2 until there are no more 2s left. And there you have the list. Let's remove that and move on to look at what's next. This will do a bullet list. We mentioned that there are several types of list. So an unordered list is a bullet list. An ordered list is exactly the same, but instead of creating a bullet list, it creates a numbered list. Very straightforward. But there is another kind of list in HTML as well. Oops, let's just remove that. and that is a description list. Used to be called a definition list. So let's fire off, and we can see how that looks differently. And you'll see that there is a term and a description. That's how the terminology goes. So let's just open that, and you can see this is exactly the same, other than the fact that we've changed the type. And description lists are a little bit more complex. So, for example, you can have more than one description against a term. And as you can see, we've done that here, and I'll show you how that works in a second. So the input needs to be an array of arrays. So what does that mean? Let's have a look. Oops, wrong one. So we have an array. An array in JavaScript is marked by these square brackets. And inside that array, the entries of that array are themselves arrays. So it is an array of arrays. And inside that inner array, we have entries. The first entry is always taken as the term, and the second entry is taken as the description. If we have more than two entries in that array, again, the first entry is the term, and the other entries are all taken as descriptions. So again, fairly straightforward. Very easy input data creates a useful set of output data. And you may ask the question, well, surely there's more things we might want to do with a list than just these simple things. And the answer there is absolutely there is. But the UIB element node is not designed, it's not there to do everything. It is there to do standard things in a very simple way. Go away, Twitter. Okay, so there are a couple of different ways you can describe the data as well. So that's a slightly different way. In this case, it's an array of objects where the key, the property of the object, is the term, and the value of that property is the description. So if I send that data, you'll see the data change. Yeah, there you go. And you can even have an object of objects if you really want to. If you just happen to end up with a more complex set of data, that's just to illustrate that this also works in the same way. So that is that. So this would be a good time to introduce you to the fact that we can do some other things here. So let's create a new node, a debug node. Let's set that debug node to show the complete message. Deploy, and let's turn on the, let's get rid of that. So I want to show you what the output of an element node is like, because this is part of the answer to what do you do if you need something more complex than the node itself is going to give you. And the answer is that instead of sending the output direct to node red, sorry, to UIB node, UI builder node, we can capture that output because it is a standard, and the standard is documented. It's all in the documentation. And the output here is UI Builder's low code output. So this is a descriptor, is a standardized descriptor that will build HTML for you. And it's standardized in such a way that you get a really good degree of configurability. It mirrors how HTML works, but without all of the complexities and the oddities that HTML brings with it. And I'm not going to go into that here. We'll cover that in another video, but just wanted you to see the fact that this is a standard set of output. It's described in the documents, and you can take this and use it yourself. Yeah, So down here you can see what we've created. We've created the outer div, and then we've given that no attributes in this particular case. We've made it the last position. We've told it what the parent is, and then that div contains a number of components. In this case, a description list, and that description list object then contains other components. And this is perhaps more complex than I really want to go into here, but each of these entries is wrapped in a div just to keep it nice and tight. And so that div has two entries, the term, entry 1, and the description, description 1. And hopefully you can see that whilst that is perhaps a bit overfacing as you first look at it, it's very logical. It follows a logical pattern, and that means that it's deterministic, which means that you can bring other flows or other programming to bear to actually amend this stuff. Not only can you do that in Node-RED itself, but you can also do it in the front end as well. So there are lots of things that you can do. Okay, so that is that. Get rid of that. What's next? A table. Tables are notoriously difficult to create in HTML. They are a complex structure. Let's have a quick look at it. If it will open up the, which it will. Oh, there we go. So it's in here. This is our wrapping div. That's our heading, and here is the table. So let's unpack it. First thing we see that there is a table head and a table body. The table head has a table row. The table row has two th entries. These are the cells of the table, and you can see that there's some other bits of data on there as well. And then the body follows a similar pattern. TD rather than TH gives us a standard cell. And that's just for a table with very few entries in it. Here. Yeah, so we've certainly got 6 entries in that table, but it was already looking fairly complex. So this is something that you really don't want to have to create by hand, and the UIB-element node is here to help. So let's have a look at the input. There you go. So in this case, we've used an object containing objects. So each outer property is a row, and each inner property represents a column, or in this particular case, the cell of that column. And you'll notice that the inner properties here, col1 and col2, they've been taken automatically and made into the column headings. In a future release, we'll have some more capabilities that will let you do more with those columns. But for now, we've just kept it simple. Similarly, your input can be an array, and that works exactly the same. That's exactly the same data, but just expressed in a slightly different way. An array of objects in this particular case. Either of those works absolutely fine. Not much more to say about that, really. It is pretty straightforward. And hopefully this is all already now familiar to you. There's the heading. This time we chose a heading level 4. We gave it a unique identifier. That's all there is to see. As previously, though, there is another entry in type, another type. Add a row to existing table. So let's inject a new row, and there's the new row. And I can keep doing that, and it will keep inserting the same data. Obviously, that data could be dynamic. It doesn't have to be static, as I've got it in this example. And just remember, all of these link outs are all connecting back to that same UI Builder entry. Remove that. Next up is a form. So this is something else that can be quite complicated to create, even though we know what we want to get out of it. But to actually create a form, as in this case here, that's quite a lot of work in HTML. And it can be quite annoying to have to manually create forms. You really don't want to do that. And you can see how complex this actually is. There's lots of entries here. And again, this form is designed to be accessible. So all the labeling is in place needed to make that the case. And it is indeed wrapped in a form, which again is something that you don't have to do, but it does make processing of the data somewhat easier. So let's just have a look at the input data to see how simple it is. And here we go. So as you can see, each one of these inner objects is an entry. So we've given it an ID so that each input has a unique identifier, which helps us, as we'll see in the output in a moment. We've given it a type, and pretty much any of the input types that are supported by HTML is supported here. Have a look at the documentation if you want to see what that is. We can say whether or not it's required. We can give it the label, text label, and we can preset its initial value if we want to. And that's pretty much it. Some input types have additional attributes. So the range input has a minimum and maximum, for example. And finally, we've ended up with a button here on the bottom. And that's important to get the data back to Node-RED. And we'll see how that happens automatically in a second. So I've not had to specify any code here to make that button send anything back to Node-RED. That's all taken care of for you. Just to note, a button can have a value if you want it to. Okay, so that's it. And let's have a look at the output. Let's clear that. So when I send this to Node-RED, I immediately get back a message. This message is in a standard format. This object is optional and comes from the UIBuilder node itself. There is a setting under advanced, include message.uib, and that tells you lots of information about the client that the button came from. So if you had 25 different people connected to the same page, obviously several of them could press that button and you would get several entries back again. So you need some way of being able to differentiate between those different inputs. And we have things like the client ID, which is much more stable than the socket ID, for example. So you have different ways there of identifying that. And you've got things like the IP address. That's just my local machine because everything's running on it at the moment. But obviously, in a typical example, that would be a different IP address for the client. So that's just standard data. These two bits are the bits that we're interested in. Let's have a look at the payload first. And as you can see, if you remember from the input data for the form, which is that one, the input data specified an ID, and those have been reflected here in the payload. So each of the inputs has got an output in the payload, including the button, because the button's got a value. If we need more detail, that's hidden under this object here, underscore UI. And this is standard for the button, which is using a standard function in the UI Builder client called event send. And this is why you don't have to worry about doing any coding in the front end, because this button, this function, sorry, does it all for you. The button has an ID. It also has a name. It has some text in the slot content. It has picked up the fact that this button is embedded in a form, and therefore it has added the form attributes for each of the inputs. And you can see this is a bit more complex than the data you get in the payload. You probably won't ever need any of that, but it is there should you ever want it. Yeah, the data, you'll need to look up the kind of where that all comes from. But this is another way in which UI Builder makes sure that it's evening out the complexities and oddities of HTML. Getting that data back is quite complicated, and all of that's now hidden for you. You don't have to worry about it. We can look at the attributes on the button. You can also see if the button was pressed with a modifier key. So let's do that. I'm going to hold down the control key whilst pressing the button. And when we have a look at this data, you can see that the control key is marked as true. So that could be really useful if you want to extend the functionality of your button. So there we go. And there's a bit of duplication here because it's telling us which client it was that actually clicked the button. And the event send function can be used on any HTML event, and it will work in the same similar way. Okay, so that's the form. Nice and easy, very, very easy way now to be able to get information back from a user back into Node-RED without having to do any programming. And this stuff all just works as you'd expect it to, because it is all standard vanilla HTML. So there we go. And one last thing to show here is we can dynamically change the values here. So let's do that. And you can see that that changed. If I reload the page, the form has completely disappeared because I'm not caching any of the data. So this has gone back to the default. Put it back. That text was called foo. And if I click this, it turns to bar. So just showing that you can control the form dynamically from Node-RED, and we've used an update here. We've taken the selector this time from the message.topic, so it's not manually controlled. That means we can use one update potentially for many different updating many different things on the page. And again, we've used JSON here. Very, very simple. We've changed the attributes so that the value attribute, which is what this is set to the message.payload. So let's have a look at the inputs. Message.payload, it's just some simple text, and the topic is a CSS selector, the ID of the row 1 input, which you know was defined in the inject up here. Okay, so I can remove that. Now, also useful to be able to pass through HTML. So this is an example here. If I run the inject, very, very noddy. But note the number here. If I press inject again, the number changes to a random number. So how have I got that to work? Well, let's have a look at it. Here we can see our payload. This time is using JSON to create a random number, which is formatted then as an integer. But random is a number between 0 and 1, so we multiply it by 100 to get a bigger number, and we can format the output. And we have a string here that we're going to pick up as well. So it's just to demonstrate that you can inject arbitrarily complex data, and we're going to use that data in a standard Node-RED template node. So it's not a UI template node. This is a an ordinary template node, which is using Mustache to take the dynamic data from the message and turn it into HTML. So the output of this is simple HTML, output as plain text, and we feed that into our UIB-element node using the type of HTML, so that the input is automatically taken and treated as HTML, sent to the front end and displayed directly. Again, same parent, we've given it an ID because it's wrapped in a wrapper, and the wrapper gets the ID. In fact, let's quickly have a look at that in our DevTools. So we've put it under more. There's the wrapper, and there is what we sent to it. Very simple in this case, but useful to understand. And this means that you could take HTML from anywhere else and feed it directly into your UI Builder created web page. No problems at all. In another video, I'll show you how you can actually get the dynamic updated HTML back into Node-RED again, which you may find useful in some cases. What's left? Dynamically change the page title. So here this says blank template, not very useful. So we'll inject a change, and it's given us a dynamic title. You may have noticed that the tab title also changed, because this actually changes both. Watch the numbers as I inject again. They keep changing to a random number. So the settings for that, page title. The parent this time is the body. It doesn't really matter actually, but it just helps steer the code. We need an ID as usual. The heading is ignored. Now what this does is, if your predefined page, if you remember how we defined the page, it's got an H1 heading on it already. So if your page already has an H1 on it, this import will just change that, and it also changes the title in the head section of your HTML. If there is no H1 tag on the page, it will actually add one, and it adds one at the beginning of the body. So that is up to you. You can still control where it goes somewhat, but typically you'd expect an H1 to be quite early on in the body. So very simple, but a nice way of being able to quickly create set a different title without you having to worry at all about coding it up. And again, remember, we can use UI Builder's caching features in order to capture all of these changes, so that when a new client connects, they get the latest data, and so their page will look correct immediately. We've not done that in this example video. Just looking at the input. Here we go, and very straightforward. Oops, a little bit longer. Yep, some square brackets, the usual random format is an integer, and some text on the end of it. And that's it. There's nothing else to say on that one. Finally, a simple text box. Very, very simple. Not much to it really. This will undoubtedly get improved later on. We've got a heading there, just reminding you that the heading can have HTML in it. But yeah, not a lot else to say really about that one. The payload is just some text. Yeah, that's it. Now, final entry, and then we can close. This, let me just expand that slightly for a moment. this demonstrates how you can chain these things together. So obviously each of these on its own is relatively simple and is probably not enough to make a complete web page. So you can chain these together. You can chain updates as well as elements. And in this particular case, demonstrating the fact that we're going to create a list first, and then after the list, we're going to create a table, but we're going to create that table inside the list. So let's do that. Let's move this back a bit. So you can see now, there's the list, and there's the table embedded in list entry 3. So how do we do that? Let's again just move that over a bit. So we start with our input. Again, obviously this doesn't have to be an inject, it could be any input. And we start with our simple list. Very, very simple. We've given it a topic. The topics are useful because of the way that caching will work. Typically you cache by topic. If you don't put a topic in, it won't cache anything. So you need to make sure you've got a unique topic because that's how the cache will be controlled. Okay, so that feeds into our unordered list. We're putting it inside more, and we're giving it a unique identifier of chain 1. So that's the list now going to be called chain 1. Next, we need to redo the payload because that's the payload is what controls the input to the element node. So simple table we've seen before, but this time we've put it in a change node, and we've set the payload. So the payload is now no longer what it was for the list, and we feed that into here, and we've given this chain 2 as an identifier, but the parent now is a bit more complicated. So we've got the selector for the chain 1 ID. Then we are saying we are looking at list items within that list, and we're looking for the third list item. So it looks complicated, but actually you quickly get used to looking at that and working out what to do. And there are plenty of things online that will help you choose those selectors and help you work through the best way of doing things. So yeah, that's it. That's just notifying you that the output from each of these can be sent on as part of the input to the next node in the chain, and they will all add to each other, and you can then send the output to UIBuilder node in the usual way. So that is a very much a whistle-stop tour through the zero-code capabilities of UIBuilder. I hope that that is useful. I hope that it makes some sense, and I hope that you can see the value and the power that is now available. This is not a replacement for dashboard, so there is no page layout here. You need to do your own page layouts. That's not what UIBuilder is about. But if you need to be able to, for example, take input from a CSV file and dump it to an on-screen table, you can now do that with very, very little effort. Similarly, if you want some user input to control your flow, then the form is exactly what you need. It's a very simple thing, but it will just work. Yeah. You can control the look and feel through CSS should you need to. But the important thing is it's very easy to create and very easy to get the data, and that is often sufficient. Okay, well, thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoy it. Please give it a thumbs up if it was useful to you. Leave me a comment. Tell me what you want to see next. Tell me if there's anything you're confused by so that I can unpack it in a little bit more detail for you. Have a good day. See you again next time.